All right, gang, Coach Gaglione here, and I've got Garrison's going to demo some core movements for you guys. While he's demonstrating some things, I'm also going to kind of talk about why you might want to do this and some considerations depending on the athlete. So no matter who the athlete is, you want to consider what do they have in terms of range of motion, what can they own in terms of range of motion, so as far as controlling that active range, and then what can they tolerate in terms of frequency, intensity, load, reps, etc. So these are all things to consider with any athlete. So if someone has like some sort of spinal cord like injury or limitations in their lower limbs, these are all going to be factors to consider. So in Garrison's case, he's obviously very, very limited. He gets around in a wheelchair most of the time. So we're going to strap him in here. It's just going to provide him a little bit more support and kind of help anchor him to the bench. So if we can provide a little bit more stability, whether we're training our trunk or some other exercise, just like we do with a competition bench, if I'm going to have more stability, that can lead to more power output and eventually more strength gains and just better performance of the exercise. So in terms of the core, we're going to go piece by piece. So what I like to think about the core is the entire trunk. So a lot of people think just abs, we're going to start with that, but it's the abs, it's the lower back, it could even be considered some hip, the muscles around the hip, and I like to also think about the lats, because the lats do kind of insert kind of into that lower back kind of region. And it's going to provide, especially the upper back, which we'll talk about in another video, it's going to provide a lot of stability when you're benching. But for some considerations with abdominal training, the primary function of the rectus abdominis, the abdominal wall, is to flex the spine. So that's going to be like kind of the most effective way to train it through that dynamic range of motion. So we need to figure out how much spinal flexion does the athlete have. So Garrison, where's your injury?
So I'm a T12 para, which means it's the lower part of my spine, near my right below my belly button. So I have limited ab function. However, I am able to engage my abs if I have like something securing me to a device, so that will help me actually complete a crunch.
So in the terms of the spine is comprised of 3 segments, so his is kind of right at the junction between where the upper back and kind of lower back kind of joins, that kind of, it's called the thoracic lumbar kind of junction there. So the thoracic spine is the upper back, the lumbar spine is the lower back. So Garrison's going to be very, very limited, if any range of motion, because of where his injury is in his low back. So the spinal flexion is going to primarily come from the upper spine. So it's going to be that thoracic kind of spine region. So for someone that has like a lower, may have more function in their lower back, they could potentially get a little bit more range in that area. Although I will say when you're doing some sort of crunch or spinal flexion exercise, most of the time having the spine move from the upper back primarily is going to be a good rule of thumb, just because from a structure standpoint, the upper back has more degrees of flexion and just more degrees of range of motion just for kind of day-to-day things. If we're thinking about kind of bending over, reaching up, the upper spine is going to have more mobility and just in general, regardless of the athlete, it's just in general. The lower spine, if you look at the vertebrae, the segments are thicker. They're designed more for stability from a structural standpoint, so you're not going to get as much range of motion there. So we want to think about, anytime we're doing a spinal flexion exercise, we want to think about bringing the rib cage toward the pelvis, and we're going to contract those muscles, okay? So what we're going to do is, so if you notice that Garrison's actually on a slight incline, which actually will make the start of the movement a little bit easier. So if you're kind of a bigger athlete or a heavier athlete and you're new to doing trunk training and spinal flexion exercises, actually on the floor may be too difficult, or maybe even too difficult at the start of the range of motion, because of where the resistance is. Our resistance is due to gravity, and the load is going to be the greatest when you're at a 90-degree angle. So by putting him on a slight incline bench, it makes the start of the movement a little bit easier. So that's a consideration. So this could be a good place to start. Also, sometimes it could be just cumbersome from getting up and down off the floor. So you can certainly do crunches off the floor. If someone does have a lot of range, I'll show you. You can also kind of potentially use an ab mat or something that can also help give you a little bit of a pre-stretched position, as well as just increase the range of motion if the athlete has the range of motion. But there's nothing wrong with just starting in a neutral position. You don't necessarily have to start with a pre-stretch. So all we're going to do here, so what we're going to do is before, we can certainly add weight and we can add resistance with a cable or a band behind him, but we're going to start off with just arms at the sides. And if we're, let's say we're on the floor, but if we're on the bench, we're just going to slide down and try to move from the upper spine only. And we're going to crunch up. And we're going to hold for, just in general, when we're doing hypertrophy type work and we're trying to strengthen the muscle, a good rule of thumb is to hold the contracted position for one count to start, and then lower under control. And I want him to think about lowering himself one vertebrae at a time. And I want him to look straight ahead and focus on just bringing the rib cage toward the pelvis. And then come down under control. So if you notice on the bench, he's actually probably getting a little bit more range of motion than you would on the floor because the strength curve is a little bit different, it's a little bit easier to start, and we're getting kind of more of that 90-degree angle toward like the midpoint of the motion where the abs could be a little bit stronger. And come back down under control. So if the athlete did have more range of motion, or maybe relax, and we wanted to maybe work on his arch for competition bench, we could certainly put like an ab mat or a towel roll or something underneath if that was the goal, if the goal was also to kind of improve the arch. Now to make it a little bit harder, we're going to go from the sides to crossing the arms like this. And what this does is it provides a little bit more resistance using his arms as body weight. So we're going to come forward, driving the elbows toward the hips, and then come down under control, one at a time. And by not having the legs anchored, if someone did have function of their lower limbs, it kind of also takes the hip flexors out of it. And this is pure ab movement. Let's do one more. How does that feel?
Feels good.
Good, okay. And then come down. So sometimes, again, this is a really simple exercise, but it's also how you execute it. So I'm sure like Garrison's done a lot of crunches before, but it's also just the intent and like how you do it. So now the next level up would be putting the hands above the forehead. And this creates even more resistance because now it's, again, this is kind of the where we're kind of bringing, we're trying to bring it here. So by bringing his body weight with his arms a little bit further back, it creates a longer lever, which makes it more, you're basically going to feel that load more. So again, if I was holding a hammer straight up and down, very easy to hold. If I was holding the hammer straight out, it's going to feel a lot heavier because now I have that length of the lever to deal with. So reason we're having the hands here versus on the neck, we don't want to strain the neck, so we're still getting the benefit of more resistance from the hands, but now we're going to just kind of crunch up from here. Good, feel a little bit.
Go here, you feel
a little bit more. And then again, we're always imagining the rib cage getting pulled toward the pelvis and then coming down one vertebrae at a time. So let's do 3 reps there. So if we wanted to really extend the set a little bit, we can actually start with the hardest version and then get a little bit easier. So we could do 3 reps here, 3 reps here, 3 reps at the sides, for example. And if I want to make this more difficult, again, I can bring him closer to I have less of an incline, or I could even add resistance through a cable or a band behind him. And I think for most people, just doing body weight is fine. Again, in terms of the bench press, the core is going to be more used for stability, but we still want to work it through a dynamic contraction because that's just going to be a little bit more efficient for gaining strength. So we could certainly supplement this with some static exercises, which we will show in another video. But I wanted to kind of show this as a starting point. So the first thing we want to do is just doing some sort of loaded spinal flexion. So I would start people off with an incline bench crunch, strapped in, starting off with the hands at the sides, progressing to the hands on the chest, and then progressing to the hands on the forehead in front. And again, we're going to hold the contracted position for a 1 count and do a slow eccentric, slow lowering. Think about lowering yourself 1 vertebrae at a time. Again, how much do you come up? And how much range of motion are you going to have? It's going to depend on the person and where their limitations lie. So if someone might just do a short range. So if someone maybe has a higher injury or higher limitation in their spine, we might only be able to come up to here. The Garrison's got a little bit more function, so he can come up a little bit higher, and he's able to control that range, and he can hang out here, and then he can come down under control. So that's going to be specific. His range of motion is specific to him and his current level of fitness, as well as his capacity of his spine. So that's going to be the first video. We're going to keep things very, very simple. That is spinal flexion to work the trunk in a dynamic fashion. Thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me, and I'll talk to you soon.